It has become somewhat of a tradition each new year to showcase some of my favourite paranormal cases that we explored together on the channel over the past 12 months. And this year is no exception. And so I invite you to sit back and enjoy this compilation. And if you are new to my channel, welcome. If you like what you see here, be sure to subscribe for all the new content I have planned for this coming year. And if you would like to take your support even further, why not consider becoming a member of my Quill and Ink Society, either by clicking the join button below or by heading over to my Patreon page, where you can get access to even more perks, including Patreon member exclusive merchandise. Thank you. I hope you enjoy. My name is Laura, and you are watching The Paranormal Scholar. Located on the magnificently rugged coastline of southern Wales, close to the village of Southerndown, the sparse remains of Dunraven Castle occupy a prominent position. A steep headland overlooking the bay, a site of such strategic importance that it was first fortified in the Iron Age. Today, very little is left of the castle manor, for centuries home to a succession of families, a fortress in times of war, an imposing hunting lodge, invaluable as a military hospital. In 1963, Dunraven Castle was stripped of its wealth and torn down. A careless demolition. And yet, despite its erasal, nothing could be done to oust its history from the land, for, according to local legend, its past has left its mark in the form of the ghosts and spirits whispered to wander the remains. One spirit claimed to be in residence at Dunraven is Walter Vaughan, a man remembered as the wicked Lord of Dunraven, an ingenious fellow who is said to have been responsible for the death of many. The story goes that Vaughan began with good intentions. Living at the castle in the latter part of the 16th century, he knew how dangerous the rocky bay which his home overlooked could be. One day, upon spying a shipwreck, he took a rope and, not caring for his own safety, swam out to the distressed vessel and saved the lives of the entire crew. After this heroic act, he produced a report outlining the ways in which such shipwrecks may be avoided in future. Central government, however, completely ignored his ideas, and thus sparked in Vaughan a desire for vengeance. Hungry for independence from London, he spent a considerable amount of his family's wealth attempting to resurrect the old Welsh chieftains. In this venture, however, he failed, and impoverished the castle in the process. It was at this point that all of Vaughan's good intentions disappeared. Desperate for money, he formed an alliance with a man called Mat of the Iron Hand, a former pirate whom Vaughan some time before had arrested. In the struggle, Mat had lost his hand, and later had it replaced with an iron hook, thus birthing his appellation. A man who knew many things about dishonest practice, Vaughan regarded Mat of the Iron Hand as the ideal fellow with whom to take advantage of Dunraven's dangerous bay. And so they became wreckers, luring ships close to the shore with lamps tied onto cattle so as to see them crash on the waves. If there were no survivors of the wrecks, whatever loot the ships carried would be Vaughan and Mat's to share. And according to legend, the men made sure there were none to survive. And so, for a time, Vaughan's fortunes improved, until one day 2 of his 4 sons came into difficulty whilst out on the sea. About 1.5 miles away from Dunraven, their boat drifted away whilst they were on a rocky outcrop. With no other boat to go out and rescue them, Walter Vaughan was forced to watch as the sea rose, swept over them, and drowned his 2 children. Around the same time, another of his sons also died, and thus Vaughan was left with only one, a young man who had gone to seek his fortune on a merchant ship. Vaughan waited for his boy to return, anxious for the safety of his only heir. One night his heir returned, A fine merchant ship approached the bay, and Matt of the Iron Hand, desirous of its loot, tempted it onto the rocks and wrecked it. Washed up on the rocky shore, there was a sole survivor, a young man who wore the ring bearing the emblem of the Vaughan family on his hand. Spying Walter Vaughan's only son, and not having forgotten the loss of his hand all those years before on the orders of his master, Matt took his revenge. He cut off Vaughan's son's hand, and with the point of his sword, ended him there on the beach. After that, he took the hand to Vaughan and showed it to him, proof that all of his sons were now gone. Today it is said that Walter Vaughan lingers on the cliffside, a wailing spectral figure, forever mourning the loss of his children. It is whispered that he can be seen at night on the anniversary of that tragic day, and that he keeps company with the spirits of those sailors who perished at his command. Aside from Walter Vaughan, other ghostly figures connected to Dunraven include that of the Blue Lady, a spectral female who is said to wander the gardens and indeed the castle itself before its demolition. According to the testimony from a lady called Jenny, the Blue Lady was regularly seen by nurses who worked at the castle during the Great War, when it was used as a convalescent hospital. Jenny's great-grandmother, she claims, witnessed the spirit on several occasions, stating that she used to appear at the end of the bed of a soldier who was dying. And nurses were not the only ones connected to the castle to engage in the paranormal phenomena. Intriguingly, the 4th Earl of Dunraven was actively involved in spiritualism and attended many supposedly incredible seances over a 2-year period, which culminated in him publishing a book titled Experiences in Spiritualism. He also, in 1926, published a collection of reports of paranormal happenings said to have taken place at the castle, taking time to interview his staff and gather first-hand testimonies, with special attention being paid to the by then infamous apparition of the Blue Lady. It seems that, in his mind at least, the spectral lady was a very real thing. Today, both she and the wicked Lord of Dunraven, Walter Vaughan, are still said to be encountered at the castle. A ruin whose walls have been all but swept away, Dunraven echoes with its past, its stories largely forgotten, but its once inhabitants perhaps less so. Sometimes people disappear mysteriously, leaving no trace behind. In very rare instances, they disappear and yet at the same time seem to remain, as if trapped somewhere just out of sight. Such was the case of Charles Ashmore, a 16-year-old from Quincy, Illinois. One cold evening in November 1878, it is said he stepped outside of his family's home to fetch water from the well. When he did not return, his father and sister, fearing that something had happened to him, went outside, lanterns in hand, to search for him. Snow was freshly fallen, and so they were able to follow his footsteps as they led away from the house. Roughly halfway to the well, however, they stopped abruptly. The footprints simply ended, without any sign of a slip or struggle. Fearful for Charles's safety, they rushed to the well to see if he had somehow fallen in. He had not, with the ice on the surface being so thick that it must have been like that, undisturbed for several hours. Charles was nowhere to be seen. Dumbfounded by the disappearance, his father and sister returned to the house and conveyed the mystery to Charles's mother. As expected, she was distraught and would not rest, pacing the house searching for clues as to the whereabouts of her missing boy. She did this for several days. On the 4th day, as she stood by the well, it is claimed that she heard Charles's voice calling out to her. She could not see him, and so immediately responded by asking her son to reveal himself, to tell her where he was. His voice was clear, and yet seemed to come from different directions. Although she continued to be able to hear him, he did not tell her where he was. This strangeness is said to have continued for several months, with family members and neighbours all able to hear Charles's voice.
Still, however, he could not be seen, with no one being able to offer an explanation as to where his voice was coming from. Over time, Charles's calls grew fainter and seemed to be coming from a greater distance, always in an unidentifiable direction. By midsummer, he was entirely inaudible, his calls having faded to nothing. Tragically, Charles was never seen or heard again. A similar case is said to have occurred some 30 years later, on Christmas Eve 1909, when an 11-year-old boy called Oliver Thomas also disappeared on his way to fetch water from his family's well. It was around 11 p.m. in the Welsh county of Powys, and the Thomas family were enjoying their festive celebrations, when the head of the family, Mr. Thomas, sent his son to get some more water from the well. Oliver put on his boots and overcoat, took the bucket, and headed outside. It is said that almost as soon as he walked out the door, Oliver started screaming. Grabbing lanterns, the family rushed outside, supposedly just in time to hear the boy shout, "They've got me! They've got me!" Believing his voice was coming from above them, everyone flashed their lanterns to the sky, but could see nothing other than the black, starless night. According to a 1966 reportage on the earlier event, Oliver kept screaming as his family frantically searched for him, his voice growing fainter and fainter until it faded away altogether. Trying to retrace Oliver's footsteps did not help. The snow was fresh and deep, and so it was easy to track his movements from the house. As expected, they headed towards the well, but then stopped suddenly, as in the case of Charles Ashmore. It is said that the wooden bucket was found about 15 feet away from the last footprint in the snow. The following day, Oliver still missing, police arrived at the farmhouse. A search party was organised and the countryside scoured. The well on the property was also searched, being probed with grappling hooks to see if the boy had fallen in. Faced with a lack of evidence, foul play was the only explanation the police could think of, and so all who had attended the party the following evening were interrogated. And yet, there was still no explanation. The boy had simply vanished, seemingly upward, away into the night sky. The similarity between these two stories, boys being snatched from the snow on their way to the well, their voices lingering after their disappearances, has led some to question whether they met a similar fate, with one possible theory being that they were taken by a large aerial predator of some variety. And yet, what manner of bird would be capable of lifting an 11-year-old boy, carrying him away across the sky, let alone a presumably significantly heavier 16-year-old? One of the more ridiculous terrestrial theories involves kidnapping balloonists. In regards to explanations of an otherworldly variety, some have suggested that extraterrestrials may have been responsible for Charles and Oliver's disappearances. Another supernatural theory is that the boys were somehow spirited away to another plane of reality, maliciously snatched by interdimensional beings, trapped in a different dimension from which their voices were able to, for a limited time, seep out from. Whatever the case may be, both boys' disappearances remain a mystery to this day. Far from what one might expect, instrumental transcommunication, namely attempts at communication with the dead via electronic devices, is not a new method of paranormal investigation. Its origins can be traced back to the early 20th century and the experiments of David Wilson and his Morse code messages. Later, as technology advanced, the appearance of EVPs, electronic voice phenomena, captured via electronic devices such as telephones, tape recorders, and radios, gripped the spiritualist community. Voices, utterances, words, and even full dialogues, which are described as having come from another dimension beyond time, have all been recorded via electronic means. In the present day, there is undoubtedly an overwhelming amount of underwhelming evidence circulating online. Yet, despite the large quantity of unclear audios, for which fraud or signal contamination are impossible to dismiss, there are still many examples of EVPs which are impressive. Indeed, some of the best anomalous voice captures remain unexplained by scientists. The subject, it can only be concluded, has largely been ignored because of its incompatibility with current scientific understanding. After all, how can a radio, which is known to have no input, produce genuine and intelligible voices? One such example of impressive ITC evidence dates back to the 1970s and the work of John Sutton, a little-known British psychic medium. Along with a friend and colleague, Tom Johansen, Sutton visited the Royal Air Force Aerodrome at Bircham Newton in Norfolk, England. During a séance at the aerodrome, Sutton and Johansen attempted to speak with the dead via a microphone and tape recorder. Sutton is said to have also communicated using his mediumistic abilities. The audio that they captured was phenomenal.
Save you, yes. Yes, we're here to save you. Tell us. I can hear you, yes.
The whispery voices on the tape are clearly audible. Not only that, they seem intelligible and respond to questions posed by Sutton. As the dialogue progresses, it is claimed that Sutton is communicating with an airman who, along with his crew, perished not far from the RAF base near the local church after their plane crashed and caught fire.
Yeah. The plane caught fire? And it crashed? Yes. Where did it crash? Do you remember? Near dear.
The voice coming through the radio is even able to provide names of the 3 airmen who lost their lives in the crash: Dusty Miller, Pat Sullivan, and Jerry Arnold.
Dusty Miller. Dusty Miller. Pat Sullivan. Yes. Jerry Arnold.
Astonishingly, the so-called spirit voice is incredibly clear. According to an article about the incident published in Psychic News on the 11th of June 1977, 3 years after John Sutton's death, investigators were able to confirm that a plane matching the description given by Sutton whilst in trance had indeed crashed near the local church and that its crew of 3 had perished. Later in the séance, in an incredible and tragic sound capture, the alleged airman asks for Sutton and Johansen to help him and his fallen comrades.
Help us. What can we do? Help us. Help us, what can we do?
It appears that the spirits are not aware of their passing and, at the time of the recording, were stuck on Earth. As such, the audio ends with Sutton instructing the airmen to look up, let go of the earth, and go towards the light.
Yes, but look up. Don't be afraid. Let go of the earth. Let go of the earth, you understand? You don't belong here. Yes, look up, ask for help, upwards, and go towards the light.
It is claimed that Sutton had never visited the area before and could not have known any information about RAF Bircham Newton or the soldiers who had worked and perished there. As for the audio itself, the clarity of the voice is difficult to dispute and cannot simply be dismissed as a figment of one's imagination. In terms of a physical explanation, the tape recorder had no input other than the sounds produced in the immediate area. Under certain circumstances, tape recorders can act like a radio receiver. However, not only did the sounds captured during the séance not resemble radio material, it has also been confirmed that, at the time the recordings were made, there were no stations transmitting audio similar to that which was captured. And so, what did Sutton and Johansen record? Who did the voice belong to? With many reports of paranormal happenings coming from RAF Bircham Newton, many believe that the tape recording is a genuine and unexplainable example of electronic voice phenomena, and that the spirit voice truly belonged to a dead airman stuck on Earth after his tragic passing.
Every creed on Earth has had a belief in some sort of primordial god of chaos. Chaos gods are not so much beings of mayhem, although they may thrive from it, but rather are ancient, all-powerful entities whose purpose is to sink all existence into darkness, and thus take us back into the void. Accordingly, in some Judeo-Christian belief structures, chaos has been identified with Satan. However, in some sense this is an incorrect similitude, for the devil desires to torment your soul within the confines of his realm of hell. This is not what chaos hopes to achieve, and so a more accurate analogy could be said to be that of the Leviathan, a serpentine dragon-like entity which is said to devour the souls of the damned, rendering a person non-existent entirely. In Gnostic belief, all existence is encapsulated by a giant Leviathan, biting its own tail and generating all the evil in existence. When one perishes, the soul must pass through the 7 realms of heaven. If they do not succeed, then the Leviathan will consume them. In this way, one may see preference in living in hell than in the mouth of the all-devouring, all-evil-creating Leviathan. Intriguingly, Norse mythology has a similar incarnation of chaos, the World Serpent. Like the Gnostic Leviathan, this serpent encapsulates the world, eating its own tail as it does. When it releases itself, it is foretold that Ragnarok, Norse mythology's version of the apocalypse, will begin. Similar again is Apophis, the ancient Egyptian deity who was the opponent of light, a great serpent associated with chaos. In fact, it is quite astonishing just how many manifestations of chaos as a serpent there are, both worldwide and across time, from the ancient Mesopotamians to Hindus to various Native American tribes to the ancient Greeks. Even the serpent in the Garden of Eden can be said to show how this creature consistently appears as a metaphorical embodiment of chaos and evil. An absolute power of darkness, chaos, is thus a cultural universal. Ancient Greeks believed that chaos was the first thing ever to exist, and that from this void all existence was brought into being, thus making chaos the very basis of reality. Existing prior to creation, it is fundamental to everything, with light, its opposite, coming afterwards. And surprisingly, present-day scientists may not wholly disagree with this ancient Greek belief. In the last few decades, science has pushed the notion that there exists a form of mysterious matter known as dark matter. Connected to this is dark energy, a force which is hypothesized to affect everything and thus influence everything in existence in the universe. Scientists happily agree that more is unknown than known about this enigmatic form of energy, but they have proposed that a colossal 68% of the universe is dark energy. Dark matter is thought to make up about 27%, which means that the rest, everything on Earth, everything ever observed with all of our instruments, all normal matter, adds up to less than 5% of the universe. It is also speculated that before the Big Bang, the emergence of light, there was only dark matter. And so, biases aside, all of this sounds rather like what the ancients already knew. Dark existed before light, and from that darkness, that chaos, came reality. Even more bizarre is how scientists hypothesize that since the Big Bang, gravity and dark energy have engaged in a cosmic tug of war. Gravity pulls galaxies closer together, dark energy pushes them apart. Whether the universe is expanding or contracting depends upon which force dominates, gravity or dark energy. Once again, this all sounds rather familiar. The original cosmic battle between light and dark, good and evil. And thus, with so little known about dark matter and the dark energy which directs it, there is ample room for speculation. Science is quite literally in the dark, and it rather strangely appears that ancient and persisting belief in chaos has some measure of truth to it. And so, just how far can we run with this notion? Is it then true that all evil stems from chaos, and that, just as the ancients proposed, there is a cognizance in that darkness, directing all the things which we call demons, spirits, tall men, mamu and fairies, all manner of paranormal entities, at the command of a dark consciousness so unimaginably vast and powerful that we, as those who came before us, can only call it chaos. It is always easier to ignore or deny the truth than to deal with it. But if you are forced, like I was, to deal with it because of an experience with an alien, then you come to a point where you rethink and accept the fact that we are not alone. These are the words of Caroline Laxon, a physician in her 50s from northern Germany, who launched a website dedicated to sharing an experience which she claims forever changed her life. The year was 1987, and Laxon was 21 years old. She and her family had travelled to Sacramento, California on vacation. One particular night, in the early hours of the 14th of July, she retired to bed just after midnight, around 12:15 a.m. It had been a long day, and she lay in the dark thinking of all that she had done and seen the past 2 weeks. Sleep didn't immediately find her. After 10 to 20 minutes, she describes being disturbed by a sound, a quiet, dull humming similar to a transformer. Not only that, she had the feeling that something was wrong in her room. It was as though someone had entered, a confusing thing for Laxon, as she had locked the door before getting into bed. Concerned, she wanted to look about the room to see if there was anybody there. When she tried to open her eyes, however, she found that she couldn't. She couldn't even move her eyelids, let alone open them. Her entire body was likewise paralysed, and had been ever since she had first heard the low humming sound. Becoming increasingly panicked, she continued to try to open her eyes. When she eventually succeeded, she claims to have seen something chilling. A human-like figure standing straight in front of her bed. Large-headed, with 2 arms and 2 legs, the figure was looking at the centre or abdomen of her body, leaning slightly forward as it did. Laxon claims she was only able to keep her eyes open for a maximum of 30 seconds, being compelled to close them, not from drowsiness, but because of some strange and unknown force. Paralysed and still hearing the humming sound, she writes that it was at this point that she realised she was completely at the mercy of whatever being was in her room. There wasn't a way to come out of this situation. But still, she struggled against it. In her head, she called out for Cora, the lady who cared for her grandmother who was with them on vacation. Her grandmother was asleep in the room next door, and Laxon knew Cora would be close by, ready to help her grandmother in the night, on a mattress in the hallway in front of her door. She couldn't speak, but desperate and scared, she hoped Cora would somehow sense there was an emergency and bring help. She didn't, and so Laxon remained frozen on the bed. After a couple of minutes, she states that she was once again able to open her eyes. The being was still in her room, but had moved, turned by about 90 degrees, looking at the door. Laxon suspects that it had somehow known what she had been thinking, her internal plea to Cora. As before, no more than 30 seconds later, her eyes involuntarily closed. Immediately afterwards, the sound stopped, and she was able to move. When she opened her eyes, the figure was gone. In the years since her experience, Laxon has drawn and painted the being that she saw many, many times, using different materials and, in her own words, developing the quality of expression in the sense of a realistic representation of what she saw. She even explains that she is doing a self-taught art course, presumably in the hopes of better capturing the creature that visited her that night in California. Undoubtedly, the figure in her artwork is haunting, describing it as human-like, but not like you and me, strange and with large yellow eyes and a blue-white aura Laxon firmly believes it was extraterrestrial. As shown in a watercolor painting she completed in 2000, she believes the being was wearing some sort of breathing device. She also has a sketch of herself in bed, eyes forced shut, as the creature watched over her. After normalcy returned to her room, Laxon was quick to write down her experience. She also claims to have looked at her watch. The time was 1:30 a.m, suggesting that over an hour had passed since she went to bed. And yet, after lying awake for 10 to 20 minutes, the encounter only lasted a few minutes. She writes that it is hard to imagine that the encounter lasted for an hour, maybe 5 minutes in total, maybe a little more or less, but not an hour. And so, what had happened during the rest of the time? Laxon cannot say. She states that she has no recollection of being, for example, pulled into a UFO, as some alleged abductees have claimed. But that is, of course, not to say that an abduction did not take place. As other cases suggest, details about what happens after an abductee is taken are not always retained. For Laxon's part, she says that she did all that she could to figure out what had happened. After checking the time, she left her room and woke Cora to see if she had seen or felt anything. She hadn't. Laxon also searched the house and garden in an attempt to locate the figure that she had seen. There were no signs of disturbances in her room, either on the floor where the alleged extraterrestrial had stood or on the window. Unable to sleep, she lay in bed, with the door open until her stepbrother entered the house at around 3 a.m. Talking with him, she was shocked to discover that some 2 years ago he had seen a UFO in the sky outside their house. It had zigzagged, moving quickly, disappearing before he was able to show it to his mother. Was this somehow connected to Laxon's experience? Had the being, whatever it was, been visiting her more times than that single night? Today, Laxon has immersed herself in research to try to explain what she saw. She writes that she was not interested in UFOs or aliens before that night, and indeed knew nothing about the subject matter, just as she has never painted or drawn as much as she has in pursuit of capturing on canvas the strange figure who stood over her as she slept that night in Sacramento. The Order of Exorcists was founded by Ron Fail Enright, an archbishop who has been involved in exorcism since the early 1980s. Now an international organisation with members in 24 countries, the Order is an autonomous branch of the Catholic Church with one purpose: to perform the rite of exorcism and thus battle the forces of evil active on Earth. In the course of his work, Fail Enright is said to have taken part in thousands of exorcisms, rituals to banish demons which he describes as being not entirely dissimilar to those portrayed in movies. When he appeared as a guest on a podcast, he even claimed that levitation does occur, and that he has witnessed it on at least a dozen occasions. During these rituals, the possessed person is said to turn grey, their skin so lifeless that they look like a cadaver. An exorcist with so much experience, it is impossible to accurately document the breadth of the Archbishop's demonic encounters. One experience, however, was said to be chilling enough to persuade the Order to release some details, more commonly kept confidential to the public. According to the press release produced by Fail Enright, it was January 2013, and he had just arrived at a well-to-do house in Hollywood, California. A man had called requesting help with his granddaughter, who had moved into the house only a month before. She was, so the man believed, demonically possessed. It was late in the day, cold and raining, but the man was waiting outside when the Archbishop pulled up to the house. Leading him to the backyard patio, the Archbishop and his assistant, Father Robert, could hear loud sounds and screaming coming from inside the house. Interviewing the grandfather revealed that the young woman was involved in an occult group where they would worship the devil and commit monstrous acts against small animals they would find in the neighbourhood. When she moved in, she insisted on taking the back bedroom for privacy, and it was from there, so the grandfather told Fail Enright, that she continued her sinister activities. It began with strange sounds and midnight visitors. Unsettling perhaps, but not enough to confirm demonic interference. It wasn't until the grandfather walked into the room and allegedly found her eating what looked like a dead animal that he knew something was terribly wrong. Blood all over her face and hair, she was giggling to herself and invited her grandfather in unmentionable ways to join her in her illicit behaviour. After that, she started to speak in another language that he could not understand, as objects began to fly around the room. Utterly terrified, confused and appalled, the grandfather fled. As the man explained all of this on the patio, the Archbishop could hear glass breaking and objects flying against the interior walls coming from inside the house. And so it was time to enter. The grandfather was said to have been so disturbed that he refused to re-enter the house until the ritual was concluded, and so the Archbishop and his assistant went in alone. They are said to have found the granddaughter in her bedroom. Resting on the floor, she was covered in dirt and blood and sweat. When the Archbishop and his assistant lifted her from the floor so as to carry her to the bed where they would perform the exorcism, she supposedly opened her eyes and, breathing fast and heavy, asked them what had taken them so long. She had, apparently, been waiting for them. As is said to be usual amongst the demonically possessed, she then invited the Archbishop to engage in all manner of profane behaviour with her. By this time it was 1 a.m. Fail Enright, as he has done many times before, began the ritual of exorcism. The young woman had to be restrained on the bed, as all about the room objects started to fly around, at first smashing against the walls, and then in the direction of the Archbishop and Father Robert. Fail Enright reveals that a lamp struck him on the head, and his assistant was hit in the chest with a fast-flying shoe. Not once did they stop praying, and they continued to administer the rite throughout the night. In fact, they claim to have continued until 2 p.m. the next day. Then they took a break. The young woman was quiet for a while, and so the Archbishop and Father Robert went to check on her grandfather, who was staying at his neighbour's house next door. When they started to head back to the house, they claimed that they heard her screaming at the top of her lungs. Rushing inside, they found her jumping on her bed. She had apparently freed herself and charged at the two men, successfully punching Fail Enright in the face with such force that he was knocked to the ground. A struggle ensued, and they were able to once more restrain her and continue the ritual. All in all, the exorcism took 3 days. Throughout, Fail Enright asked the demon possessing the young woman to reveal its name. Eventually it did, and thus, with the power to command it in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, the Archbishop was able to force it to leave the young woman's body. According to the order's press release, after the exorcism was concluded, quiet and peace came over the house, and the grandfather and his granddaughter were able to move on with their lives, the young woman no longer being interested in the occult and entirely free of the devil. A happy ending to a dramatic tale of demonic possession, an ending which Fail Enright stresses could have been very different. After all, for all those around the world currently claiming to be in the grip of diabolical malevolence, actively seeking exorcists, devilry is at an all-time high, and doesn't seem to be lessening anytime soon. When it comes to secret societies, the veil of mystery is naturally thick. Yet it can be said that one occult organisation is more mysterious than all the rest combined, and that its history is not merely rich, but long, having been active for 2,000 years.
In 268 BC, the Indian subcontinent acquired a new ruler, the Emperor Ashoka. The grandson of his dynasty's founder, he was known as Ashoka the Great and styled himself as the beloved of the gods, an ideal universal ruler who championed the acquisition of knowledge, fairness, and animal welfare. A competent warrior, in the 8th year of his reign he conquered the Kalinga region. Victory, however, came at a terrible cost. 100,000 men and animals were killed in action, and many times that number perished as a consequence of the fighting. It is said that Ashoka greatly regretted the suffering, and so, after the annexation, decided to wage war against war itself. Believing that knowledge and not violence was the hallmark of true power, he made efforts to spread Buddhism throughout the Indian subcontinent, determined to avoid future suffering by guiding intelligence away from evil and towards peace. As great as he was, Ashoka realized that this was not a task he could perform alone, and so he sought the advice and guidance of the most brilliant minds in his dominion. Summoned before him, he bestowed upon 9 men the task of collecting, preserving, and advancing all the knowledge an omnipotent universal ruler required. As such, each of the 9 men was given an area of expertise: propaganda, physiology, microbiology, alchemy, communication, gravity, cosmology, light, and sociology. Believing that the ordinary man risked being corrupted by such knowledge, the identities of the 9 men were kept secret, as was their work, and indeed their very existence as a secret society. Thus was the origin of the 9 unknown men. Far from being a relic of ancient history, it is speculated that the 9 unknown men continued their work long after the death of Ashoka the Great. The secret society was designed to be eternal. If a member was unable to continue his work, through death, disease, or otherwise, a successor of equal genius would be identified, approached, and initiated. The number of 9 was imperative. The society could continue, providing it had exactly 9 members at any given time. It is suggested that as the influence of the 9 unknown men spread, its membership expanded also, with great minds being sought from all across the world. Some of the most notable geniuses in history, including Isaac Newton and Albert Einstein, are even speculated to have been members of Ashoka's 9 unknown men. What makes the 9 unknown men truly mysterious is the information the society is said to guard. The 9 disciplines which the 9 members represent are thought to encompass much secret knowledge, information that, if leaked, would be considered not merely enigmatic, but controversial and perhaps even dangerous. In terms of physiology, there is the forbidden knowledge of the touch of death, namely how to end someone's life with a single touch. This information, it is said, was indeed leaked and birthed the martial art of judo, which teaches a technique whereby seemingly non-lethal force applied to a pressure point is reputed to facilitate the instant demise of an opponent. As for what other knowledge the 9 unknown men possesses, it can only be speculated. Such is the shadowy nature of this society. Some of the most incredible conjecture includes the discipline of communication extending beyond the earthly, with it thought that the 9 unknown men guard knowledge relating to extraterrestrial communication with alien life forms, and that the discipline of alchemy includes the transmutation of metals, the most well-known form being the ability to convert base metals into gold. Whilst the truth can never be known, many do believe that the chain is unbroken, and that Ashoka's 9 unknown men remain behind the curtain, continuing to influence the world from the shadows to this very day.
In the mountainous regions of Central Asia, there is rumoured to exist an atrocious creature. One written description of the monster dates to 1876, when the renowned Russian imperial geographer and explorer Nikolai Przewalski pushed into the wilds of Mongolia. There, local people whispered of a man-beast, an extraordinary animal which, if given the opportunity, would attack and indeed prey on Przewalski. Based on his interactions with the locals, the geographer wrote how hunters were not only afraid of attacking the beast, but that the inhabitants removed their habitations from those parts of the country which it visited. After all, the creature was said to possess a flat face like that of a human being, and a body covered with thick black fur. Its strength was terrible, and its feet were armed with enormous claws. The monstrous animal was called the Almasti, a name which, despite having numerous variants in local languages, has no known origin. Based on the research of one scholar, the term is so old that it is unable to be translated. Others have suggested, in desperation, that the term's closest translation is demon. Whatever the case, mere utterance of the name provokes fear, even today. And indeed, according to one of the most detailed recollections of an encounter with an Almasti, such fear is warranted. It was the autumn of 1925, and Mikhail Topolsky, a major general of the Red Russian Army, was trailing a troop of anti-Soviet guerrillas. According to the written testimony attached to this case, he and his scouting party were led to the Pamir Mountains of Central Asia, where it was believed the guerrilla fighters were operating. It was whilst passing through a series of highland villages that Topolsky claims to have heard rumours of hairy man-beasts which local people warned were hostile to humans. Undeterred, the scouting party continued their search. They eventually came across the rebel troops' tracks and followed them along a mountain path to a glacial overhang, a precarious cliff-edge position where the by now exhausted guerrillas had decided to rest. The upper tongue of the glacier hung from the cliff, in which there was a cave. Surrounding the fighters' position, Topolsky and his men threw their first grenade. The explosion triggered one of the guerrillas to emerge and beg for them to stop. More grenades would cause the ice cave to collapse and bury everyone inside. After a quick discussion, Topolsky agreed that the man should return to discuss surrender with his companions, and so they watched as he went back into the cave. It is said that soon after, Topolsky and his men heard an ominous hissing as the ice began to move. At almost the same moment, they heard shots, and not knowing what they meant, decided it was the beginning of an assault. Pieces of ice and snow started falling down from the cliff, burying the entrance to the cave. As it collapsed, 3 men came rushing out. The scouting party fired shots, leaving only one survivor. Breathless and seriously injured, he gave Topolsky the following information. They had not launched an assault, but had, in fact, been attacked themselves. According to the fighters' testimony, they had been discussing surrender when several hairy man-like creatures, howling inarticulately, appeared in the cave, emerging, so it seemed in the chaos, from a dark crevice towards the back. There were several of them, and they had staves in their hands. In the attack which followed, one of the guerrilla fighters was supposedly clubbed to death by the creatures. The man recalling the story explained that he too was clubbed, being struck on his left shoulder as he rushed to the entrance of the cave. Ice and snow falling all around him, he just about managed to escape, one of the stave-wielding creatures hot on his heels. The survivor claimed that the hairy man-beast had fallen behind him, having been shot and subsequently buried by the snowslide. In disbelief, Topolsky ordered an immediate excavation of the area. Incredibly, a body was recovered. According to the written account, it had been shot 3 times, and was found near a stick made of very hard wood. At first glance, Topolsky thought the hair-covered body was that of an ape. And yet there were no apes in the Pamirs. Not only that, the body itself looked very much like that of a man. Certain it was some sort of trick, the scouting party's doctor made a full assessment, examining it, measuring it, even pulling at the hair to see if it was just a hide used for disguise. The creature, however, was real, and was most certainly not human. The carcass was determined to have belonged to a male, some 5 feet 5 inches tall, with well-developed muscles and hair all over its body. Judging by the greyish colour of its hair in several places and the callous skin on its palms, it was thought to have been elderly. Examined by the soldiers, it lay dead in the snow, with its eyes open and its teeth bared. Chillingly, the teeth were large and even and shaped like human teeth, and yet no such man-like creatures were known to exist in the mountains. Unable to bring the heavy carcass down the mountain with them, the scouting company were forced to leave it, and so buried it where they had found it. As for the cave and the other creatures claimed to have been crushed within, that too was left, the soldiers being fearful of another collapse. And so the Red Russians returned home, their objective in a roundabout way complete. If the story is to be believed, the enemy force was indeed shattered, not by them, but by a group of Almasti.
In Welsh mythology, stories of hellhounds stretch far back to antiquity. Celtic tradition swarms with innumerable tales of a dog of darkness, a canine creature with fiery eyes that howls at night, known as the Gwythgi. According to myth, Aaron, king of Annwn, an otherworldly realm, is said to keep a pack of these black hellhounds at his disposal. His hounds are said to come in the colder months of the year, so as to hunt down wrongdoers and drag them to his realm. Some associations have been made between this legend and historic sightings of the Wild Hunt, whereby people attest to witnessing phantom armies, complete with spectral hounds, appearing in the sky. Yet, not all Gwythgi belong to Aaron. There are many more that are said to exist outside of his control. Often, eyewitness testimonies connect these otherworldly animals to lonely roads at night. It is said that the dog's fiery gaze has the power to paralyze its victims. In the Vale of Glamorgan, there are several tales of encounters with such hounds. In the 19th century, an English visitor to the area alleged to have become paralyzed upon hearing its howl from a distance, so much so that his legs did not work and he had to be assisted home. In another report, a farmer named Jenkin claimed to have seen a Gwythgi at night when he was returning home on a mare. His horse was so frightened by the hellish dog that it threw him off into the mud. Due to the Welsh hellhound's vicious reputation, it is speculated that there have been many more unknown stories with less fortunate endings. A supernatural stalker, many fear the Gwythgi as an unstoppable hunter which trails its victims until it is close enough to attack and tear them to shreds. To this very day, sightings of the hellhound persist across Wales. Mark Rees, a prominent Welsh author and folklorist, has documented a more recent encounter, which is said to have occurred to a night security guard at the Corran Resort, located on the south coast of Carmarthenshire. According to the security guard, the hotel always turns unnaturally cold between 3 and 4 in the morning, regardless of the time of year. During one of the nights he worked at the resort, he was taking a break around this time in room 5 of the hotel. He was watching a film and he started to doze off when, all of a sudden, he became completely paralyzed. According to his testimony, nothing he did could make him move. He was trapped within his body. It was then that he saw a black thing in the room. It looked like a huge black Alsatian dog. The security guard was completely terrified, but still was unable to move. The only thing he could do was stare at the black dog as it bared its teeth at him before disappearing. Other employees of the resort have also reported encountering the hellhound. One woman even alleged to have run away from the hotel as fast as she was able after seeing the beast run across the bar one night. Curiously, the security guard whom Rees interviewed to document this encounter had never heard of the Gwythgi before, and was shocked to find out that there were other cases like his in history. For him, there was no doubt as to what he had seen.
And so, in this case, there may be more truth in the legends of the Hellhounds of Wales than it first seems. Jenny Randalls is a former Director of Investigations with the British UFO Research Association and a well-regarded author on all manner of paranormal phenomena. With over 50 books published on subjects as diverse as crop circles, time slips, ESP, and life after death, it could be said that Randalls has a high tolerance for the strange. And yet, when writing about the Men in Black phenomenon in 1997, there was one case which baffled even her. Describing the incident as the strangest MIB case, indeed just about the strangest case of any type she had ever been involved in, Randalls was left unable to explain the incident, and even after extensive personal research, was only able to conclude it was extraordinary. For Randalls, the story began on the 4th of December 1987, when she received a letter from a man who claimed to be a former police officer. The man wrote to Randalls requesting her help regarding a strange encounter he claimed to have had some 3 days earlier, on the 1st of December, whilst walking over Ilkley Moor in Yorkshire, England. It was about 7:45 AM, and he had been going to visit a relative when he decided to take some photos of the landscape en route. It should have been a perfectly ordinary outing, and yet, when approaching the village of East Morton, the man told Randalls he saw something peculiar, an unusual figure on the rocks, dark green and with a large head. According to his letter, the figure appeared to gesture to him, and so, camera in hand, the man quickly photographed the strange green figure, then watched it scuttle away around a rock formation. The man hurried after it, and was just in time to see a disc-like object. Stunned, he watched it shoot into the sky, the camera in his hand forgotten. Abandoning his plans to visit his family, the man hurried back to civilization, only to discover that the time was different from what he had expected. The clock on the church showed it to be 10 AM. He had been walking about 7:45, and there was no way that over 2 hours had passed. Unnerved, he took the bus to a nearby market town to get his film developed. Shockingly, the picture of the strange figure came out. Randalls wrote that she was initially impressed by the letter, the man who requested to keep his identity protected and asked that Randalls refer to him by the pseudonym Philip Spencer, came across as a rationalist, despite the strangeness of his story. According to Randalls, he seemed utterly disinterested in publicity or making money from his photograph, despite knowing how newspapers would pay to publish his image. He was instead more concerned with the preservation of his reputation. He was a former police officer and did not wish to damage his career prospects. Randalls was quick to respond to Spencer's letter, stressing to him the importance of proper testing of the photographic evidence. She did not receive a reply to her letter, and it seemed as though the case was cold. Then, a few weeks later, Randalls discovered that Spencer had contacted another researcher and was thus able to speak with Spencer directly over the phone. At this point, Randalls' interest in the case grew. Aside from the photograph and the story itself, there was something peculiar about the witness. When Randalls was eventually able to speak with Spencer over the phone, and later to meet with him in person, she was struck by how remarkably laid back he was. He, according to Randalls, lacked the sort of emotional tie to the case that one ought to expect of someone who had secured such dramatic evidence. In a word, he came across as disinterested, even though he had been the one to request help from the UFO researchers. Analysis of the photograph confirmed that it was not trick photography, but a real object on the moors. What that real object was, of course, was impossible to ascertain. Feedback from a professional wildlife photographer who Randalls and fellow researcher Peter Huff contacted suggested that there was indeed a small greenish entity with a large head standing on the rocks, but that the image was too fuzzy to confirm whether it was a living creature or a model or doll. Eventually, Randalls came to the conclusion that the case must have been a hoax. An encounter with a little green man seemed too convenient, too fanciful, too bogus to be true. And yet, what were Spencer's motives for fraud? His disinterest in what Randalls described as the photographic scoop of the century was impossible to ignore. With no desire for fame or fortune, Spencer simply stuck to his story. It was what it was, and he wasn't overly excited about it. As Randalls and Huff continued to investigate the photograph, the case became stranger still.
In March 1988, several months after the original incident, Spencer agreed to meet with a clinical psychologist. Under hypnosis, Spencer revealed something he had not before, a missing memory, in which he had been abducted by the green creature he had seen on the moors. According to a transcript of the hypnosis session, Spencer became increasingly more agitated as he relived the experience and described being stuck with everything going fuzzy as the creature came towards him. An especially disturbing extract from Spencer's hypnosis session is as follows. "I'm floating along in the air. I want to get down. I still can't get down and I don't like it. I'm going around this corner and this green thing is in front of me. Oh God, I want to get down. There's a big silver saucer thing, there's a door in it, and I don't want to go in there." Spencer also described being shown 2 films by the aliens whilst on board their ship. The first film supposedly contained lots of scenes of destruction, including starving people and waste going into rivers. Sinisterly, when the psychologist asked him what was on the second film, Spencer replied by saying he was not supposed to speak about it. When pressed to reveal details, he said, "I'm not supposed to tell anyone about the other film. It's not for them to know." Peter Huff's transcript of the session described how Spencer's breathing became faster as he spoke, and how his voice sounded worried and afraid as he detailed his entrance into the big silver saucer. Undeniably, it is disturbing to contemplate a normally laid-back individual expressing such emotion whilst discussing what can only be described as a terrifying abduction experience. The psychologist who facilitated the session was also impressed, and was certain that Spencer was describing an experience that he believed had really happened. Not only that, the missing memory seemed to explain the loss of time Spencer initially reported. In many ways, it would be easy to ridicule this case. There are many alien tropes, green spacemen, silver flying saucers, even the abduction of an unconcerned Yorkshireman strolling across the moors sounds cartoonish. And yet, it was not so ridiculous to escape the attention of the men in black. According to Randalls, on the 15th of January 1988, while Spencer's photograph was out of town being examined by the wildlife photographer, Spencer phoned Peter Huff late at night, upset, claiming that he and his wife had just been visited by 2 men claiming to be from the Ministry of Defence. They had arrived at 8:30 p.m. and had stayed at his house for 50 minutes. The men both appeared to be in their early 40s, wore smart business suits and produced photo ID cards that bore the MOD symbol. One of the men, who claimed to be called David Jefferson, did all the talking, whilst the other, whose surname was Davis, remained silent. They claimed they had come to interview Spencer about his sighting, without revealing how they knew about it. Spencer's case was not publicly known. Only Randall and 3 others knew the details, and more importantly, Spencer's real identity. In Randall's own words, there had been no publicity whatsoever for the case, and the MOD simply could not have then known about it through any normal means. Not only was the agents' appearance strange, but also their behaviour. According to Spencer, they seemed perplexed by the electric fire in the room, and wanted to know how it worked, asking him many questions about it. Eventually returning to Spencer's sighting, the man in the suit called Jefferson asked Spencer if they could have the negative of his photograph. Spencer was stunned. He had not told them about the photo, and yet they seemed to know about its existence anyway. When he told them that he did not have it, and that it was with a friend, the men in suits simply got up and left, not stopping to ask who the friend was. Spencer was by this point unsettled. Who were these people? How did they know about his sighting? Keeping his identity a secret had been his priority from the start, and so he was all the more upset the next morning when, at 8:55 a.m, he supposedly received a phone call from the Mirror Group newspapers. The caller claimed that they knew Spencer's real name and address and were going to publish his story. Terrified that it was all getting out of control, and suspecting that Randalls and Huff were responsible for the leak, Spencer phoned Huff again, demanding his negative be returned and the investigation ended. Randall, shocked and trying to figure out what was going on, immediately phoned both the London and Manchester offices of the Mirror Group newspapers. careful about the information that she gave them, she simply referred to Spencer's case as the story regarding a UFO photograph. Despite her phoning within an hour of their alleged call to Spencer, no one at either office knew anything about the story. With the journalist's interest piqued, Randalls quickly hung up and relayed the information to Spencer. It seemed that whoever had phoned him had not been the newspaper, but was instead someone trying to intimidate him into ceasing research into his sighting by playing on his deepest fear, publicity, and the damage it would subsequently cause his reputation. What was going on? After much prodding and several written requests, Peter Huff was able to get a response from the MOD, who admitted in writing that they did not send anyone around to see the witness that day. They would not, however, confirm or deny the existence of intelligence officers with the names Jefferson and Davis. Equally, the unit which wrote to Huff was unable to claim that no element of the British government might be able to send people around to speak with a UFO witness, only that they did not. As for Spencer, at the time of Randall's writing some 10 years after the original incident, he still asserted the truth of his encounter. The green figure had been real, as were the men in black who had pursued and intimidated him in the aftermath. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this and have not done so already, please subscribe for more of the paranormal. To watch the featured videos in full, you may find the corresponding links in the description. Until next time.